First of all, Lord Hennessy, are you completely obsessed with the European Union, as Jacob Rees-Mogg has said about some of the lords who defeated the government?
I think there's a special anthropology to their lordships when it comes to Europe, because think of their age. The House is full of people who, in their political and public life, strove mightily to get us into the EEC and to make it work once we were in. And they're sitting there seeing their life's work diminished. Not just diminished, but taken apart. And also, they're in the House of Lords, there are people who've made it their life's mission in politics to get us out of the EEC, or EU, as it now is. And also, for them, it is very anxiety-inducing, because they think that it's been caveated away by all the talk of a customs union of some kind. And so you have people who, in their twilight years, I have to be careful using language of my colleagues like that, can see their professional lives being shredded. But I think the House of Lords, for me, Parliament is a great oratorio. I'm a romantic about Parliament. But the House of Lords' function, above all, is to provide the recitative. But it always has to be the arias in the House of Commons, Jacob's people, Alison's people, not us.
Right, but are they defying the will of the people?
The will of the people is a very tricky concept. I'm one of those people who believes, though I am a Remainer, was a Remainer, that we have to accept the result of the referendum. I voted against the idea of paving the way to another second referendum. So I think that one has to respect the will of the people, but it's very difficult in any country when you run a system of plebiscitary democracy, referenda, up against representative democracy.
Right.
The friction is immense, and this is an expression of that as well.
Right. Well, let me welcome Alison McGovern, the Labour MP, into the studio. But first of all, listening to that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you think the Lords has overstepped the mark now, outlived its use?
Well, let me begin by saying that I can say, and actually mean it, that I have the greatest respect for Lord Hennessy, and listening to him explain what's going on in the Lords is just such a beautifully clear understanding of the situation.
You're very kind.
And, well, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, there are, I think, two people in the country who properly understand the Constitution. You're one, and Vernon Bogdanor is
I think he's in awe of you, Peter.
He's very, very kind.
And so I think...
I would add Meg Russell as the third.
So I think we're very lucky to have Lord Hennessy on, and what he has to say is so important. And the definitions he uses are, I think, spot on. I think you do see people in the Lords whose life work is being threatened. Are they challenging the will of the people? My concern is that some, but not all of the amendments, and I could go through which ones if you wanted, break the conventions. I think the convention that manifesto commitments are not overridden in the Lords is important. And I think saying that the Conservatives didn't win an overall majority and therefore their manifesto commitments don't count is a specious argument, and therefore the vote on the customs union particularly was the Lords overstepping the mark. When it comes to Henry VIII powers, on the other hand, I think the House of Lords was doing exactly its constitutional job as a revising chamber.
Right.
So I think there are bits of both within.
So do you agree, though, with Jacob Rees-Mogg that when it comes to manifesto commitments, the Salisbury Convention, that the Lords don't vote against government manifesto commitments, although Labour said much the same when it came to the customs union, that actually the Lords has overstepped the mark? I've
been worried about the Salisbury Convention for a long time now, particularly nearly 10 years ago now, I think, 8. When the House of Lords was debating, and nearly filibustered actually, which we don't do, on the revised constituency boundaries, because the Salisbury Convention was lying in shards on the floor of the chamber, and the Lib Dems were saying, well, we never signed up to it in the first place, it was a Conservative Labour thing in 1945. So, and I suggested that we needed another convention, but we didn't get round to doing that. And also manifestos these days are like concertinas. There are so many pledges. But I do take Jacob's point very seriously. We do need to tread very carefully.
Right. But did they overstep the mark, yes or no?
Well, I voted for the customs union thing, so it's a slightly disapproving look from my old friend, but I have to say, be honest about it.
I think there is a problem with this convention and that's brought about by the referendum and the way in which that was conducted, because, of course, there was no manifesto on either side in the referendum.
But there were manifestos, of course, going into the elections.
That's right, that's right.
The general
but then,
election
unfortunately, we're in this situation of a hung parliament. Now, Jacob's entitled to his view that the Conservative government did, they stood on a manifesto, and that the convention refers to the government's manifesto, whatever the actual result. But I think the public don't really see that. I think what they see is a hung parliament that's desperately trying to reflect what's going on in Britain in a democratic way, and that just means that nobody's manifesto can override anyone else's.
And don't they just have the right to put forward what they really think? These are sincerely held views, Jacob Rees-Mogg, just like yours is a sincerely held view. Maybe they genuinely believe in the Lords, those who defeated the government or helped defeat the government, that the UK is better off staying in the European Economic Area or EFTA after we leave the EU.
But this is where the constitutional conventions are so important. The House of Lords, other than the 1911 Parliament Act as amended, has very, very significant powers. It could, in fact, disrupt the whole of any government's legislative programme. It has an absolute veto on secondary legislation. There'll be many issues where they feel very strongly, but our constitution works because the unelected and unaccountable second chamber obeys the conventions. This was the problem with Nick Clegg's reform of the House of Lords, because it assumed the conventions would just stay regardless of the new composition. And actually the conventions have been under change, in flux, since 1999 when the hereditary peers went. And we do have an issue as to how the conventions are now working, and it troubles me that they're not working well at the moment.
Yes, we clearly do have a problem in the situation of a hung parliament, where we're dealing with, you know, possibly the big political issue of my generation, certainly, and we have a House of Commons that's quite divided, where it's, as I was saying, desperately trying to grapple with how you reflect what's going on in Britain when people are dealing with this big issue. And then the House of Lords is left in a position where Salisbury Convention doesn't really hold because nobody really won the election. So what are they supposed to do apart from give, and I, you know, don't agree with an unelected House, to be quite honest, but
you don't mind them agreeing with you on this?
Well, I think they're in a terrible position because all they can do is give their best advice as they see it.
I mean, isn't the truth that you're just upset with the Lords because they're not doing what you would like them to do? They're not agreeing with you on Brexit. You opposed the reform in 2012. Alison McGovern, I suppose you could say conversely, is happy with what the Lords is doing because she agrees with the views that they're putting forward on Brexit. This is just sour grapes.
This is, I think, an unduly cynical view of political life, that I think the constitutional conventions are important. And that's why I differentiated between those areas where I think the House of Lords is doing its constitutional role. I think it's completely entitled to overturn Henry VIII powers because they weren't a manifesto commitment, they weren't an issue of debate in the last general election.
Hardly represents taking back control.
Well, that's a separate issue. I'm actually very nervous about Henry VIII powers. That's a separate discussion.
I totally agree.
But the Lords was acting within the conventions on that. On the customs union, and indeed taking out the date, it seemed to me it was going against the conventions because it was going against the very clear will of the House of Commons on a manifesto.
What do you say to that?
I voted against taking out the date, but I think in the big picture, I'm a rotten forecaster, I must admit.
Well, you're not alone there.
I think when it comes to the big showdowns, they're on the floor of the House of Commons, and I think pretty well everybody in their Lordship's House knows that. But it's a question of at what point you stop the ping-pong, which is going to be another great psychodrama. Yes. This European question is like no other. It disturbs our atoms to the most remarkable degree, puts stress within parties. It even strains friendship. I'm glad to say Jacob and I's friendship is intact.
For now. No, that seems very cynical.
Forever.
I mean, do you think it's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords?
I don't think pull the plug is the right answer, but I think you're going to need to look at how the conventions work. I think this came up...
What does that mean, Jacob? I mean, is it time to get rid of the House of Lords?
It came up with the issue on secondary legislation relating to a work and pensions, essentially financial measure. That was an issue that has been left unsettled. It's come up again with how the Salisbury-Addison Convention works. I agree with Lord Hennessy that it needs to be clear you do need to update these conventions from time to time so that people understand the framework under which they're working. There is a place, an effective place, for an unaccountable revising chamber, but it needs to operate within the conventions, and we need to be clear what those conventions are.
Right.
And since 1999, we've been much less clear on the conventions because the appointed peers have felt they had much more legitimacy than the hereditary peers.
All right, well, let's talk about one of the issues that has caused so much consternation in the House and amongst politicians, which is the customs union. Without going over the various options or the two particular options on the table, would you accept, Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is being talked about and tweeted actually by one of your colleagues, Nick Bowles, an extension to staying in the customs union with the EU beyond the transition period to put in place the sort of arrangements that may then make it it possible to have a technological answer to coming out?
It's very hard to see that this would be necessary.
But would you support it if it was offered?
Well, I don't think it's necessary. I think that we voted leave in 2016. We're now talking about extending the customs union until 2023. That is 7 years. The wheels may grind fine and slow, but this is an exceptionally slow grinding. I think the implementation period to the end of 2020 is quite sufficient.
But HMRC came before the Treasury Select Committee and said that even before the changes they will need to make for whatever the customs arrangement is going to be, which we don't yet know, the government haven't yet said what it's going to be, they were undertaking the biggest change programme in Europe already. And I think the expectations that the government have of them just look like they can't practically be met. Now, I would have my own argument about the mishandling of, you know, what the Brexit negotiating position was, but the fact is we can't just like leave businesses to it. We can't just like sort of throw them in it and say, well, you'll just have to cope with whatever it is. That's just not fair to people in the British economy.
But would it be an acceptable compromise to you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, to stay in the customs union as is because of the changes that Alison McGovern say will be very difficult for businesses, and then move to what they call maximum facilitation, which is this technological solution, if it were to work and solve the Northern Ireland?
HMRC is introducing a new computer system for customs declarations, which it said clearly in evidence in front of select committees it was confident but couldn't guarantee because of the nature of all new.
I was in those sessions, and I can promise you.
I was in sessions with them too.
That was absolutely not the impression that we were given.
The volume that they can do with their new system will include customs declarations on goods coming from the European Union.
All right.
And it's just a question of having the will and the desire and the focus.
There's 130,000. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jacob, but this is really important. There's 130,000 businesses in this country that will need to do customs declaration that currently don't, and you know, because of the EU, are likely never to have done one. I'm really concerned about them. A lot of small and medium-sized enterprises in this country, and I don't think the noise coming out of the Brexiteers at this moment is realistic.
You're being unrealistic. You're putting down red lines that are actually making it difficult to reach a solution.
I don't think that's right. I think we've already been very full of compromise, that we have accepted the transition period, we've accepted an extension of 21 months.
And will you accept a compromise over the customs union?
The customs union means we're effectively staying in the European Union.
So no.
So no, of course not. Of course I won't accept.
So that is a red line. Any extension, any remaining in it.
That we stay in the customs union would be an extension of membership of the European Union and would be a dramatic failure of government policy. As David Davis said in evidence to the Brexit Select Committee, he said if we stayed in the customs union a day beyond the 31st of December 2020, he would view it as a personal failure.
Right. What will you do if Theresa May says that's the only option? That's the only way. If you look at the makeup of the House of Commons, we've obviously had all these defeats in the House of Lords. Even the Cabinet is balanced towards the option that you don't like, the customs partnership. Do you not just have to compromise further on the customs union?
The government got elected on a manifesto saying we would leave the customs union. Theresa May reiterated this in an article.
It was a hung parliament.
Hold on. Well, the government is the government, and unless it loses a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, it is the government and its policy is what the Prime Minister is committed to implementing.
Will it end up as a vote of confidence then over
nodding
this?
Whilst I say
but
that.
Will it end up as a vote of confidence over this? Are you prepared to go that far?
Hold on. The Prime Minister wrote an article for The Sun on Sunday just last weekend saying that she was going to leave the single market and the customs union. I trust the Prime Minister to do what she says she will do.
One of her preferred options is the customs partnership, which you've rejected.
The customs union partnership seems to be running into the sand because the issue with
according to Greg Clark, the business secretary.
Well, that was on Sunday, and we've had further developments. That seems to be running into the sand because it practically doesn't work. And it's perfectly reasonable for the government to examine options and then conclude that the option doesn't work.
Yeah, but I would just like to hear an option that could work, because, you know, this idea of technology, I'm afraid, doesn't deal with the issues on the island of Ireland. The border is incredibly sensitive and complex, and it's much more than, you know, whether you have physical infrastructure. It's about checks and you know, processes that will be targets, and where people feel they've had an identity where they've been able to look either way on the island of Ireland, and that's a very important part of the Good Friday Agreement that has to be protected.
When is Theresa May going to have to make up her mind on this?
Well, the negotiations are taking place as we speak.
Sure, but time,
would hope to
I hate to quote Michel Barnier in that way, but time is running out.
Time flies, yes, as a little boy said when he threw the clock out of the window. But the idea is there will be an outline by the end of October.
Right, but we've got to get on to some sort of trade talks by then. I mean, in terms of the customs union, when is the decision going to be
We have to
made?
get it through the European Parliament.
Right, I mean,
this is the essential part of the trade, is the customs issue. And with the Northern Irish border, there are already checks. It is a border for currency, it is a border for immigration, it is a border for excise, and it is a border for VAT.
Right.
So you're just adding one more thing for which it is a border. That does not need a hard border or physical infrastructure.
Let's just talk about
adding in that sentence.
One of the things that we haven't talked about are
food
food prices, because you think that food prices will come down when we leave the EU. You don't think they will. And in fact, the Lords subcommittee, your favourite house, reported on trade post-Brexit and said an average 22% tariff would be put on food with price rises at the checkout, which wouldn't help the poorest in society, would it, Jacob?
Well, the House of Lords has missed one very important thing, and that is that if you are in a negotiation for a free trade agreement, you can maintain your existing standards for 10 years under WTO rules. So we have 10 years from the point at which we leave the European Union to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, which would mean we could carry on with our zero tariffs. So this is something the report just ignores. It's unaware of, and I'm afraid,
I mean, surely it hasn't ignored. Well, surely it hasn't ignored it. They know what they're talking about.
No, they don't, unfortunately. I've read the report. It's got no reference to this WTO rule.
Are they Remainers as well? Is this a conspiracy?
Well, the chairman of the committee is a former member of the European Parliament, so it's a fairly safe bet that he's Remainer. But let's look at page 27.
UKIP had members of the European Parliament, so that's hardly fair.
But let's look at page 27. Current retail prices for sirloin steak in the US is £12.67 per kilogramme, and in the UK is £22.06 per kilogramme. If we import for them in the US, we can almost halve the price of beef.
Well, let's all go out and eat sirloin steak.
Jacob might be worried about people who can eat steak. I'm worried about the 1 in 5 people in this country who are already facing food insecurity. We've had an explosion of food banks, and it's not just tariffs, Jacob. It's also putting rocks in the road of the trade that happens to produce food on a daily basis.
This is really important.
But that's what Jacob's suggesting. It's the non-tariff barriers. It's the bureaucracy that would be adding in to the food industry. That's what I'm worried about.
But this is voluntary. Why would a British government want to make importing food harder? It can make it easier. It can reduce the price of tariffs by 22%. It can have free trade. And it can say that all the food produced in the EU whose standards we accepted up until the 29th of March 2019 is still of a good enough standard to come into the UK. So what this report is saying is that a British government, as an act of self-harm, would put up prices for the British people. This is madness.
Final word to you.
There is absolutely no evidence that unilateral trade measures are good for free trade. There is no evidence at all. This is what all the Brexiteers say. Actually, multilateral trade agreements are what facilitates trade. That is what the EU single market is, and that's how we keep food prices affordable in this country.
All right, thank you both for coming in and bringing in the Lord's report.
Well, I always do my homework before coming in.
That's why we invite you. Thank you.